Dark train tracks snake through the countryside as a faint whistle echoes in the distance. A lone drifter leaps from a slow-moving freight train, his boots crunching on gravel. This transient figure, unassuming at a glance, will soon earn a terrifying nickname: the Railroad Killer. His real name is Ángel Maturino Reséndiz, and during the 1990s he embarked on a cross-country murder spree that left at least 15 people dead across the United States. By hopping trains and slipping across borders, Resendiz evaded capture for years, stalking victims near the very rail lines that carried him. In tonight's episode, Quick Crime Vault unravels the chilling true story of a man authorities suspect in as many as 23 murders. A ruthless predator some would dub an angel of death on wheels. He lived on trains, hopping on and off while killing people across the country. One account would note of Resendiz's itinerant lifestyle. With no permanent address, no car, and using a web of aliases, this Mexican drifter moved through the U.S. like a ghost. The FBI manhunt to stop him spanned multiple states: Texas, Kentucky, Illinois, Florida, Georgia, and more. Law enforcement would come to learn that Resendiz, often known by the alias Rafael Resendiz Ramirez, exploited the vast railroad network to strike and vanish without a trace. Under the cover of darkness, near desolate train yards and quiet trackside neighborhoods, Resendiz found his victims. He favored blunt objects: rocks, pickaxes, tire irons, often grabbed from the victims' own homes. His attacks were brutal and personal. Many victims were bludgeoned beyond recognition, some sexually assaulted, and nearly all ambushed in places they felt safest: their homes or alongside loved ones. As we journey through Resendiz's life and crimes, we'll follow a chronological timeline of his offenses, especially his bloody rampage from 1997 to 1999. 1999! Delve into the twisted psychology and delusions that drove him, and see how a dedicated task force and an extraordinary family betrayal finally brought this rail-riding serial killer to justice. Stay tuned for real interview excerpts from the case, scene reenactments that place you at the heart of the investigation, and a gripping look at how law enforcement finally caught the railway killer. Let's begin where the legend of Ángel Maturino Reséndiz was born, on the lonely tracks that became his hunting ground. Drifting back and forth across the border, Resendiz illegally hopped freight trains while working seasonal farm jobs, recounts one Justice Department review. Born in rural Puebla, Mexico in 1959, Ángel Leoncio Reyes Resendiz, who later adopted the name Ángel Maturino Reséndiz, had a troubled upbringing along the U.S.-Mexico border. By age 14, he was already sneaking into the United States. Over the next 2 decades, Resendiz would be deported or voluntarily removed 17 times, only to return again and again under false identities. He racked up arrests for burglary and other felonies, serving jail time in places like Florida and New Mexico. Each time he finished a sentence, immigration authorities sent him back to Mexico, and each time he slipped back north to continue his criminal wanderings. By the mid-1980s, Resendiz's crimes escalated from property offenses to violence. In 1986, he later confessed, he committed his very first murder: an unidentified homeless woman in Texas, whom he shot 4 times, dumping her body in an abandoned farmhouse. The same year, he claimed a second victim, a man he said was the woman's boyfriend, shooting him and tossing the body in a creek. These early killings went unsolved for years, only revealed by Resendiz's own admissions much later. In 1991, he struck again, bludgeoning a 22-year-old man to death with a brick in San Antonio. Still, at the time, police had no idea these scattered murders were connected. The transient killer left scant evidence, and his identity remained a mystery. By the mid-1990s, Ángel Reséndiz was a man in his late 30s drifting aimlessly but harboring dark compulsions. He had no permanent home, no car, no credit cards, no phone, nothing that left a paper trail. Instead, he found freedom in the railroad, sneaking onto freight trains that crisscrossed the country. He would later say, "The railway was my home." This lifestyle made him virtually invisible to authorities. He could commit a crime in one state and, by the time the body was found, be hundreds of miles away, riding a train to his next destination. As one investigator recalled, Resendiz roamed the country by freight train and landed himself on the FBI's most wanted list because of it. Little did anyone suspect that starting in 1997, this drifter's sporadic violence would explode into a full-fledged murder spree. And it would all begin beside a quiet set of tracks in Florida, with two young runaways who crossed paths with a self-proclaimed angel of death. It's a mild spring evening on March 23, 1997, near Ocala, Florida. The sun has set, and two teenage sweethearts from Illinois, 19-year-old Jessie Howell and 16-year-old Wendy Von Huben, walk along the railroad tracks hoping to catch a free ride. They had hitchhiked on a freight train heading south, dreaming of adventure and farm work in the orange groves. Instead, they found Ángel Reséndiz riding the same rails. Resendiz bashed Jessie's skull with a railroad air hose coupling, killing the young man and leaving his body beside the tracks. He then turned on Wendy Von Huben. The terrified 16-year-old was raped, strangled, and suffocated with duct tape, and her body was buried in a shallow grave in a nearby woods. Resendiz later claimed he killed the couple because he believed they were anti-Christians, an early glimpse into the warped religious delusions that would pepper his explanations for murder. At the time, however, these killings in Florida went unsolved. Two youths on the run had vanished, and their killer hopped a train out of state, leaving hardly a clue. That summer, Resendiz is suspected to have struck again, this time in the rail yards of Southern California. On July 5, 1997, a 54-year-old drifter named Roberto Castro was beaten to death with a piece of plywood in a Colton, California rail yard. While Resendiz was never formally charged in that case, authorities later identified him as the prime suspect, given the modus operandi and his presence in the area. Again, the killer drifted on. What if someone wanted you dead, but you lived to tell? The tagline from 48 Hours teases one of the most pivotal encounters in Resendiz's spree. On August 29, 1997, in Lexington, Kentucky, that very scenario unfolded. College junior Holly Dunn and her boyfriend Christopher Meyer, both students at the University of Kentucky, left a party near campus for a stroll by the railroad tracks. As they walked along the moonlit tracks, Resendiz lay in wait. He crouched hidden behind a metal electrical box by the rails, watching the young couple draw near. Without warning, the drifter sprang out and confronted the pair with a weapon. He demanded money. They had none. Then quickly bound Chris's hands with the straps of his own backpack and tied Holly with her belt. Both were gagged and shoved into a drainage ditch beside the tracks. Holly would later recall the surreal horror of that moment. 5 minutes earlier, I'd been laughing and flirting. Now I was frozen with terror. As the couple struggled, Resendiz left briefly and returned wielding a 52-pound rock. He lifted the rock high and brought it crashing down on Christopher's head, crushing the 21-year-old student's skull. Holly begged, "Turn his head so he doesn't choke." But with chilling calm, the attacker replied, He's gone. Chris Meyer was dead. The railroad killer then turned his attention to Holly. He stabbed her in the neck with an ice pick-like object to subdue her, then brutally raped and beat her, smashing her face with a plank until she lost consciousness. Incredibly, Holly Dunn survived. Bleeding and gravely injured, her jaw was shattered, her eye socket broken, her body punctured and bruised, she managed to free herself and staggered to a nearby house for help. Holly became the only known survivor of Ángel Resendiz's attacks, a living witness who would later help identify and testify against the killer. But in 1997, that identity was still unknown. Holly could only describe a man with expressionless eyes, a drifter with a Mexican accent who had materialized out of the night. Local police were horrified by the assault on the young couple, yet they had little to go on besides Holly's testimony and a vague composite sketch. By the end of 1997, the pattern was starting to take shape, though law enforcement had not yet connected the dots. A train-hopping killer had left a trail of bodies from Florida to Kentucky, and possibly California. He attacked near isolated stretches of railroad track, favored blunt force over guns, and targeted victims of opportunity: couples, drifters, the young and fit as well as the vulnerable. And he was just getting started. After the Kentucky attack, Resendiz slipped back into the shadows, likely crossing back into Mexico periodically to lie low. But by late 1998, he was on the move and killing again, this time targeting older victims in their homes, yet still near the ever-present railroad lines. On October 4, 1998, in the tiny town of Hughes Springs, Texas, 87-year-old Leafy Mason was found dead in her house. She had been beaten to death with an antique iron tool after a burglar entered through a window. The brutal murder of an elderly widow sent shockwaves through the community. At the time, it was a mystery. Who would savagely kill an old woman in a rural town? The answer lay on the railroad tracks. Mason's home was near a busy freight line, the perfect hunting ground for the railroad killer. Barely 2 months later, on December 10, 1998, another senseless killing occurred, this time in the community of Carl, Georgia. Fannie Whitney Byers, age 81, was found bludgeoned to death in her home. The weapon, a heavy tire rim. Once again, the victim's house sat only a stone's throw from railroad tracks. In fact, initially police arrested a local couple for Byers' murder, unable to imagine it was the work of a roaming stranger. Only years later would authorities learn that Resendiz himself admitted to an FBI agent that he had killed Fannie Byers, exonerating the locals who had been wrongfully charged. The violence was escalating, and Resendiz was growing bolder. 1 week after the Georgia murder, he struck again, this time in the affluent suburbs of Houston, Texas. On December 17, 1998, Dr. Claudia Benton, a 39-year-old pediatric neurologist, returned home to West University Place after a late night at work. Unbeknownst to her, Resendiz had snuck into her home near the Union Pacific Railroad tracks that very night. When Dr. Benton failed to show up for work, police performed a welfare check, and they discovered a horrific scene. Benton had been raped, stabbed, and bludgeoned repeatedly with a large bronze statue inside her bedroom. The sheer brutality shocked even veteran detectives. But amid the carnage, investigators found a critical clue. The killer had stolen Benton's Jeep Cherokee and fled. Within days, the missing Jeep was located hundreds of miles away in San Antonio, Texas. Inside, law enforcement recovered fingerprints from the steering column, prints that, once analyzed, matched a man known to police as Rafael Resendez Ramirez. "We had a name. Finally, a name," one Texas Ranger recalled. The fingerprints linked the murder of Dr. Benton to a suspect with a long rap sheet of border arrests and aliases. Authorities now realized that an interstate serial killer was on the loose. More forensic work quickly connected Benton's case to the earlier murders. The same DNA was found at multiple scenes, and a nationwide violent crime database, VICAP, flagged the similarities. The FBI formed a multi-agency task force to work the case, and by January 1999, the hunt for the so-called railroad killer was on in earnest. But as they scrambled to catch up to Resendiz, he was already planning his next deadly moves. By 1999, Ángel Reséndiz was running out of time. But he didn't know it. He continued crisscrossing the country by rail, attacking with impunity even as law enforcement closed in. The first half of 1999 would be marked by a frenzy of murders and the climactic takedown of the railway killer. On May 2, 1999, in the tiny community of Weimar, Texas, the congregation of the United Church of Christ was shocked to find their pastor and his wife had missed Sunday service. Reverend Norman J. Skip Cernick, 46, and Karen Cernick, 47, lived in the church's parsonage adjacent to the railroad tracks, an idyllic pastoral life until that night. Resendiz slipped in through an unlocked door and bludgeoned the couple to death with a sledgehammer as they slept. The scene was utterly merciless. After killing the Cernicks, Resendiz sexually assaulted Karen Cernick's lifeless body, an act of depravity that horrified investigators. He then stole the couple's red Mazda and fled. Weeks later, the Mazda turned up abandoned in San Antonio, the second time a victim's car ended up in that city, and fingerprints inside tied the Cernick murders to Dr. Benton's case. The investigators' worst fears were confirmed. The same killer was striking again and again. By now, the FBI task force and local Texas authorities knew they were chasing an extraordinarily mobile and dangerous predator. The case hit national headlines. Resendiz's face, or rather the face of Rafael Resendez Ramirez, the alias he was known by, was broadcast on programs like America's Most Wanted, and wanted posters went up across the country. The public was warned. An elusive serial killer was riding the rails, likely armed, extremely violent, and liable to strike anywhere a train could go. Despite the pressure, Resendiz was not done. In early June 1999, he committed arguably his most brazen series of attacks, murdering 5 people in the span of just 2 weeks. On June 4, 1999, in Houston, Texas, 26-year-old schoolteacher Noemi Dominguez failed to show up to teach her second-grade class. Police arriving at her apartment were met with a gruesome sight. Dominguez lay dead, bludgeoned to death with a pickaxe. The killer had likely climbed in through a window off the fire escape. Later that same day, only 4 miles away, 73-year-old Josephine Konvica was attacked on her farm near Weimar, the very same town where the Cernicks had been killed. Resendiz, having driven Dominguez's stolen white Honda an hour out of Houston, arrived in Weimar and used the very same pickaxe to slaughter Mrs. Konvica in her home. He left the bloody pickaxe embedded in her head. The only thing that spared a third victim that day was chance. Resendiz rummaged for the keys to Konvica's car, intending to steal it, but couldn't find them. Frustrated, he fled back to Dominguez's Honda and disappeared into the night. The Konvica murder removed any doubt that these crimes were connected. The FBI's forensic labs confirmed the pickaxe and fingerprints tied Houston and Weimar together. Within days, Ángel Maturino Reséndiz was placed on the FBI's 10 most wanted fugitives list. He now held the distinction of being the 457th fugitive ever to make that notorious list. The reward for his capture ballooned to $50,000, then $100,000. Communities near rail lines were on edge. their residents sleeping fitfully behind locked doors and loaded guns. The press was calling him the railroad killer, and sightings of the rail-riding drifter were reported from Texas to Canada. Some true, many phantom. Even as the manhunt intensified, Resendiz slipped through authorities' fingers in a jaw-dropping incident. On June 1, 1999, just days before the Dominguez and Convica murders, Border Patrol agents actually caught Resendiz trying to cross into the U.S. near Santa Teresa, New Mexico. At the time, they did not realize who he was. Resendiz gave them yet another fake name and birth date, and because the system hadn't yet linked that alias to the murders, the agents voluntarily deported him back to Mexico the next day. In effect, they unknowingly let the railroad killer go. It was a devastating procedural blunder. Only 48 hours later, Resendiz waltzed back across the border again, and within days committed the 5 murders of early June. This shocking lapse later prompted a Department of Justice inquiry and much soul-searching in law enforcement. One can only imagine how differently events might have gone if Resendiz had been held on June 1st. Lives may have been saved. Oblivious to how narrowly he had escaped, Resendiz continued his rampage. On June 15, 1999, in the quiet village of Gorham, Illinois, the killer reached the end of the line, both literally and figuratively. Gorham was a tiny town by the tracks in the Midwest, and that day 80-year-old George Morber Sr. was expecting a visit from his daughter, Carolyn Frederick, 52. Resendiz broke into Morber's home, which sat only about 100 yards from a railroad line. He shot the elderly man in the back of the head with a shotgun. When Carolyn Frederick arrived and walked into this nightmare, Resendiz assaulted her as well, binding and raping her before using the shotgun as a bludgeon to beat her to death. He hit her with such force, the shotgun shattered into pieces. It was a scene of unspeakable brutality. After killing the Morbers, Resendiz rifled through the house for valuables and cash. He stole George Morber's pickup truck and fled south. Illinois police soon found the abandoned truck in Cairo, Illinois, not far from the Kentucky border. Inside the ransacked Morber home, investigators recovered fingerprints that positively matched Resendiz. The case was now white-hot. The FBI, Texas Rangers, U.S. Marshals, and police across North America were all on the lookout for the rail-riding fugitive. Armed now with his true name and face, they distributed wanted posters far and wide. Media coverage reached a frenzy. The story had everything: a mysterious drifter, random brutal murders, a multi-state pursuit, and fearful communities from the South to the Midwest. On June 21, 1999, Ángel Maturino Reséndiz was officially added to the FBI's most wanted list, as mentioned, and became one of the nation's most notorious fugitives. Tips poured in from the public. Police patrols staked out rail yards and hobo camps. Yet the killer remained at large as June turned to July. Ultimately, the key to catching Resendiz would not be an FBI profiler or a lucky police patrol, but the betrayal of someone in his own family. Throughout June and early July 1999, law enforcement's net drew tighter. The FBI task force assigned to Resendiz worked around the clock, coordinating with local agencies in every likely state. They publicized the case on television and in newspapers, emphasizing Resendiz's habit of riding freight trains and warning people living near tracks to be vigilant. This pressure began to have an effect. In Mexico, Resendiz's family grew increasingly fearful. His face was all over the news, and there were even reports that Mexican bounty hunters might try to track him down for the hefty reward. Resendiz's older sister, Manuela, was especially torn. She loved her brother, but recognized that if he wasn't stopped, He would either kill again or be killed. In early July, Manuela made a fateful decision. She contacted Texas Ranger Drew Carter, the lead Texas lawman on the case. Ranger Carter and the FBI worked quietly with Manuela to arrange Resendiz's safe surrender. Through phone conversations passed along by family, they persuaded Ángel that he would not be harmed if he gave himself up. They even agreed to arrange a psychological evaluation for him and ensure his safety in custody. On July 12, 1999, the plan was set in motion. Manuela, accompanied by Carter and an FBI agent, traveled to the U.S.-Mexico border at El Paso. The next day, July 13, 1999, Ángel Maturino Reséndiz emerged from hiding and met his sister on the Puente Zaragoza Bridge, connecting Ciudad Juárez to El Paso. In a moment as dramatic as any Hollywood ending, the diminutive 5'6" killer shook hands with Ranger Drew Carter and calmly surrendered. After months of terror, the railway killer was in custody without a single shot fired. His sister's gamble had paid off. She later received an $86,000 reward for her crucial assistance in the capture. Resendiz was immediately flown to Houston, Texas, to face charges. Television cameras captured the images of a shackled, expressionless Resendiz being led by officers, a slight, ordinary-looking man who had carried out monstrous acts. As one reporter noted, his innocuous appearance, a quiet, bespectacled 39-year-old, belied the savagery of his crimes. Law enforcement breathed a collective sigh of relief. "We got him," an FBI official announced at a press conference, crediting the relentless multi-state cooperation and the courage of Resendiz's family. But even as Resendiz was brought to justice, investigators began to sift through open cases across the country. Could he be responsible for more unsolved crimes? Over time, Resendiz would confess to additional murders in places like San Antonio and Mexico, bringing his possible victim count to 23. Not all could be verified, but the sheer scale of his violence was sobering. With Ángel Maturino Reséndiz finally behind bars, the question remained: why did he commit such horrific crimes? What drove this angel of death on wheels to bash in the heads of strangers along the railroad route? In custody, Resendiz offered disturbing and often conflicting explanations for his actions. One recurring theme was religion and delusion. Resendiz saw himself as on a mission against evil. He told investigators that certain victims, like the young couple in Florida, were anti-Christian, implying he was doing God's work by eliminating them. He spoke of demons and spirits, claiming that he sensed evil in his victims, a rationalization for why he attacked people who had done nothing to him personally. In his twisted worldview, Resendiz may have cast himself as a soldier of God, ridding the earth of sinners. Yet in the next breath, he would deny responsibility, saying, "The devil made me do it." Psychiatrists who examined Resendiz found evidence of serious mental disturbance. In jailhouse interviews, he exhibited grandiose delusions, at times claiming he was half man, half angel, and therefore invulnerable. He told doctors, "I don't believe in death. Me, as a person, I'm eternal. I'm going to be alive forever." He even insisted he could not be executed because, in his bizarre reasoning, one cannot kill an angel. These statements and others led a court-appointed psychiatrist, Dr. Pablo Stewart, to conclude in 2006 that Resendiz's delusions had completely taken over his thought processes. Dr. Stewart believed Resendiz was not competent to be executed, as the killer seemed lost in a web of religious psychosis. However, earlier forensic evaluations had deemed Resendiz legally sane at the time of his crimes and fit to stand trial. He clearly knew right from wrong in a basic sense. After all, he took steps to avoid capture and lied to police repeatedly. Prosecutors portrayed him as a cunning predator who used the cloak of mental illness only once caught. The truth likely lies in between. Resendiz appeared to have genuine delusions and a disordered mind, but he was also calculated and in control enough to meticulously evade authorities for years. Resendiz's modus operandi offers a window into his psyche. He tended to linger at crime scenes after a murder, sometimes eating food from the victim's kitchen or sleeping in their home, a brazen behavior suggesting a lack of fear or an assertion of dominance. He often took sentimental trinkets from victims, jewelry, personal items, and later gave these to his common-law wife and mother back in Mexico, as if trophies or twisted gifts. In several cases, he carefully laid out the victims' driver's licenses or IDs, studying them to learn about who they were. This odd ritual hints at a desire to connect with his victims after death, or perhaps to relive the power of what he'd done. Yet, in a contradictory move, Resendiz would sometimes leave cash at the scene, almost like an offering or an act of remorse. Why? We can only speculate. Maybe he felt guilt fleetingly, or perhaps he had a superstitious notion of balancing the scales. Physically, Resendiz was a small man, about 5 feet 6 inches tall, and he knew his limits. He admitted he avoided attacking large, strong men who might overpower him. Instead, most of his victims were women, the elderly, or unsuspecting younger people taken by surprise. In nearly every case, he struck with such overwhelming violence. A rock dropped on a skull, a pickaxe swung with force, a hammer brought down, repeatedly, that the victim had little chance to fight back. His killings were overkill. Extensive trauma to the head and face was his grim signature. Some investigators theorized that Resendiz harbored intense rage, possibly toward his mother or other figures, which he enacted on strangers. Others pointed to his transient life. Each murder perhaps gave him a feeling of control and identity that he lacked as a nameless drifter. Ultimately, even experts struggled to pin down Resendiz's exact psychology. Was he driven by delusional missions from God, or was he simply cruel and evil? At his trial, one FBI agent described Resendiz as a man with no conscience, no remorse, nothing human in his soul. Even George Benton, the husband of victim Claudia Benton, attended Resendiz's execution and said watching the killer die was like seeing evil in human form, a creature without a soul, finally vanquished. Harsh words, but given the brutality of Resendiz's deeds, many found them fitting. After his surrender in July 1999, Resendiz's legal fate moved swiftly. Texas, with multiple murder cases tied to him, took jurisdiction. He was charged with capital murder, and prosecutors decided to focus on the December 1998 killing of Dr. Claudia Benton for the first trial. A case with rock-solid evidence, fingerprints and stolen property linking Resendiz to the scene. Other jurisdictions waited in the wings to try him for their homicides if needed. Resendiz initially pleaded not guilty by reason of insanity, but the mountain of evidence and his own contradictory statements undercut this defense. The trial began in May 2000 in Houston. The star witness was Holly Dunn, the only survivor, who bravely took the stand to recount the night of her attack in 1997. Facing her attacker in court was an emotional ordeal, but Holly's testimony put a human face on the horror and helped convince the jury of Resendiz's culpability and continued danger. On May 18, 2000, after only 10 hours of deliberation, the jury returned a verdict of guilty of capital murder. Ángel Maturino Reséndiz showed little reaction as the verdict was read. In the penalty phase, the prosecution presented evidence of his other crimes and the ongoing threat he posed. The defense's pleas that he was mentally ill did not sway jurors. They handed down the death penalty without hesitation. As the sentence was announced, Resendiz smirked and told the courtroom they would never really kill him, an echo of his delusion that he was immortal. Legal appeals dragged on for a few years, but ultimately proved fruitless. By 2006, Resendiz had exhausted his appeals. Despite a last-minute psychiatric appeal arguing he was not competent to be executed, courts found otherwise. The state of Texas was determined to carry out the sentence on behalf of Resendiz's victims. On June 27, 2006, just after 8 p.m. at the Huntsville Penitentiary in Texas, Ángel Maturino Reséndiz was executed by lethal injection. In the death chamber, the 46-year-old finally dropped his hardened facade and made a surprising final statement. As witnesses, including victims' families, looked on, Resendiz turned his head and spoke words of apology and repentance. "I want to ask if it is in your heart to forgive me. You don't have to. I know I allowed the devil to rule my life. I thank God for having patience with me. I don't deserve to cause you pain. You do not deserve this. I deserve what I am getting." With those final words, "I deserve what I am getting," the lethal drugs entered his veins. At 8:05 p.m., Resendiz was pronounced dead. Outside the prison, reporters noted that a thunderstorm raged overhead as the execution took place. In a macabre coincidence, a train whistle sounded in the distance just moments before Resendiz died, as if the rails were bidding farewell to their dark passenger. For the families of victims, justice had been served, though it could never bring back their loved ones. Holly Dunn, the survivor, said she took no pleasure in Resendiz's death, but felt relief knowing he would never hurt anyone again. Ángel Maturino Resendiz's bloody saga holds a stark mirror to society's vulnerabilities. He exploited gaps in the system, hopping over borders, using fake names, slipping through databases, and for years, he literally got away with murder. His case led to reforms in how agencies share information, especially regarding violent suspects and immigration status. Yet, haunting questions remain. How did a man so repeatedly in custody slip free so many times? Could more vigilant coordination have saved lives before that final deadly June of 1999? And perhaps the most unsettling, are there other drifters out there, moving unseen along the nation's railways, who learned from Resendiz's methods? There's also the question of motive. Resendiz gave varying reasons: battling anti-Christians, fighting demons, serving God, or succumbing to the devil's influence. But can any rationale truly explain the depth of savagery he inflicted? Was he mentally ill to the point of not understanding his actions? Or was he a cold-blooded killer who found a convenient excuse? Even in death, the enigma of his psyche endures, leaving criminologists and psychologists debating how much was delusion versus outright evil. And what of the victims we may never know? Resendiz hinted at many more murders beyond the 15 confirmed. In one 2003 interview from death row, he claimed innocent people were serving time for some of his crimes. Authorities have closed some cold cases based on his confessions, but others remain unsolved. Did Resendiz take additional secrets to his grave? The railway killer case forces us to confront how one transient individual slipped through the cracks and terrorized a nation. And it challenges law enforcement to never let it happen again. Yet, amidst the darkness of this tale, we also saw inspiring courage and cooperation, a survivor who refused to let evil win and helped convict her assailant, a sister who chose to do what was right despite the cost, and a determined team of investigators who stopped at nothing to bring justice. Their stories shine light on an otherwise grim journey. 30 minutes have brought us face to face with Ángel Maturino Reséndiz, the railroad killer, a man who used the rails to unleash hell across America until justice finally caught up with him. If this deep dive into a chilling chapter of true crime gripped you, let us know your thoughts. What do you think drives someone like Resendiz to commit such atrocities? Could anything have prevented his rampage sooner? We invite you to join the conversation. If you found this comprehensive true crime story informative and compelling, please like this video and leave a comment with your theories or reflections. Don't forget to share this video with fellow true crime aficionados and subscribe to Quick Crime Vault for more in-depth documentaries every week. By engaging with us, liking, commenting, sharing, and subscribing, you help us continue to shed light on dark cases just like this one. Thank you for watching, and remember to stay vigilant out there. Until next time, stay safe.